Hello, and welcome back. This video is about adding the logic to check if we have won or lost. It's a win! And a special thanks to all my supporters. Thank you for helping me help others. So, tower defense games are generally about protecting some object or base at the end of the path. We'll just call this the heart, and given that, we can define our win condition as when there are no more enemies available, and our loss condition as when the heart has been destroyed. So to do the latter, we first need to create an event to signify the enemy has attacked the heart. So in our event manager, we can't actually duplicate dispatchers like we can with other stuff, but it's going to be the same thing here. Just sends along an enemy. So we'll call it on enemy attacked with an input of enemy type enemy base. So where does this get called? In our wave manager. When we advance our enemies, we're moving forward, and then if they've got to the end over here, if they're at the end of the path length, then they get added to this expired enemy a local array. And then at the end, we just iterate through that array and remove everything from the enemies list and destroy that actor. So we're just going to update this here and call the on enemy attack. So I'm just going to move this down so there's room. From here, we're going to want a sequence. I'm going to control drag this down here. And from here, we just want to get our event manager. Check that it is too legit. And use that to call on enemy attacked. And we're sending along this enemy. So then the blueprint that subscribes to the on-enemy attack can reduce the health of the heart and deal with that as it goes. Part of dealing with that is that we need to check the wave manager if there are any enemies remaining. Add a function here called do enemies remain. And the first thing we can check here is we have our enemies array. This is the array of all the currently active enemies. So if the enemies array is empty, that means we then need to check our wave data. So for that, we'll go through and iterate that. Oh yes, this function also is just returning a bool, so we can add that now. This is just enemies remain. And in the case where the enemies list is not empty, we already know right away that enemies remain, and we can just return here. In the case where there's no active enemies, but we want to check whether there's any waves that still have enemies, we can then break out our wave data. As a reminder, the way that this is being updated is as we go through and update the wave, we're taking our wave data, we're checking the delay remaining, and then we're decrementing spawn count. So spawn count will end up at 0 when there's no more spawns for that specific wave. So we can do that check here as well. So as long as it is greater than 0, so there's still some remaining, we can also just return true. If any of the waves have spawn count remaining, you can return early and say that yes, there's enemies remaining. If it gets to the end of this loop, then that means there are no enemies remaining. So we don't forget to uncheck this and then spend 10 minutes trying to figure out why it's not working. So with that done, we can go into our game mode. In here, we can just create a variable for our heart health. This will be a float. We can set this value to 25. And then in our begin play, we want to then use this event manager to also bind event to on enemy attacked. And similarly, we'll drag out from the event here. We don't call add custom event, we call create event. For that, we can create a matching function, which we can hit F2 and call on enemy attacked. Before I forget, I'll just go back to the event graph here and finish this up. Now we're handling our win-loss condition in the game mode. So for that, we're going to add a few functions. The first of which is just when a win or loss condition has succeeded, we will just call game ended. We will send along a Boolean. We'll just say is win. We're not going to add all the logic for this right now, but for now we can just throw a print string. In here, I'm just going to say game ended, but was it a win? And throw in the Boolean value here. So it'll just say true or false at the end of that. I want this print string to stick around longer, so I'm just going to make it last 20 seconds. And then for now, I'm just going to be calling set game paused so that stuff is still not moving after we have determined that the game has ended. So game ended gets called from two functions. The first is check if when, and in here we're using our wave manager to call do enemies remain. So the only time you can win the game in this tower defense is if there are no more enemies left to spawn and there are no more enemies on screen. So in this case, we want a branch. But I like to keep the logic on true here for game ended. So I'm just going to add a Boolean not, or a not Boolean in the middle of that. So if the enemies not remain, then that means our game has ended with a win. For the check if loss, very simple function. All this is doing is checking to see if our heart health is less than or equal to 0. In the case it is, the game has ended, but it's not a win. Now, where is the best place to call check if win or check if loss? In our game mode here, we have an on enemy died. That's not it. Over here. So when an enemy dies, it's calling the event manager's on enemy died. We subscribe to that event, so we have on enemy died here. So it makes sense, logically, we just throw this in here. Anytime an enemy has died, we can check the win condition, because that's the only time that you can have one is when the very last enemy has died. So we'd like to put the call here, because it makes sense. However, we can't do that, because the logic in check if one is that it's asking the wave manager if there are any enemies remaining. And the logic there we just put in is that if there's enemies in the array or there's enemies left to be spawned. The problem is in our wave manager, we have similarly subscribed to the on enemy died event. So in here we have our on enemy died, and we're removing the enemy from the enemies array. That's all good. However, you can't guarantee which function that's subscribed to an event is called first. So if our game mode version is called first, it will check to see if there's any enemies remaining. The enemies count will be 1 at the very last enemy because this hasn't had a chance to have that enemy removed. So we have to make sure that this version gets called first. As always, there are a number of ways to fix this. We can call the check if one from here, the wave manager, or we could keep the call in here and then have this function no longer subscribe to the event and call this function from here. So in either case, we're effectively getting our game mode here and calling one of those two functions. I think the better of the two is actually to remove this here. And we're going to we'll just get rid of this debug stuff for now, or print string stuff. And here then we're just calling get game mode. And on that, we're just calling the check if one. So back in our game mode, then we also have when does the check if lost get called? And that would be on enemy attack. So on enemy attack is doing damage to the heart. And the way we're doing that is we're taking our enemy, we're getting the ability system component. We're using that to call get gameplay attribute value. And we're using the enemy set damage that we have not yet actually done anything with, so we'll have to do that as well. But we're just getting that value. We're taking our heart health and we're just subtracting the damage value and setting it back to heart health. And then we're checking if loss here. Check if loss is very simple. You could have just thrown that in here as well, but I like to have the synergy between the two win-loss functions there. So we're going to add damage to our enemy blueprint the same way that we added our health and whatnot. So for that, we'll go into our enemy base. We have our variables here. We just create an initial damage, make that a float. We're going to set this initial value to 1 so it actually has an effect in case we forget to add it elsewhere. I'm just going to quickly update the two enemies. So for the enemies here, I'm just going to take our initial health that we've figured out earlier and just divide it by 10. So that will be 5, and that makes this one 8. And we're using a gameplay effect to set that in our begin play here. We're getting we're making an outgoing spec for our GE enemy attributes. We're setting those set by caller values and then applying it. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to zoom out a bit just so I can grab all this and this. Let's move it over here. Just going to duplicate, oh, we don't need that, just this section. Can control drag from over here to there, reconnect that, control drag that, pop that in there. And we have our initial damage we can throw in here. Let's spade this out a little bit. I forgot to hold shift, so I'll do that again. I don't actually need this print anymore. I'm just gonna alt click that to remove it. And we want to set our data tag here. So for that, we're going to create a new data tag. We'll call this enemy.damage.setByCaller. Select our source, hit add new tag, select it. Looks good. And then we update our gameplay effect. enemy attributes. So we're just adding one new modifier down here. It will look like the other modifiers. It is damage, it is override, and it is set by caller with the data tag we just created. Make sure everything is compiled and we should be good. So if we throw down a few turrets, you may want to balance this differently, so you need a little more than 2 turrets. And there we go, the game is ended, but was it a win? Yes, it is. This is still here because we paused the game immediately after. Eventually you'd want to do some kind of delay, maybe explode the enemies, and then at the end of the explosion, call the odd enemy died. We'll look at the other condition, which is if they all, well, not all, if they get enough to the enemy that the heart is destroyed. I'll just throw in one turret over here to make it look a little more interesting. Should take about 5 enemies because it's at 25 health. And there we have. The game has ended, but it was a win, or was it a win? And no, so we lost because enough enemies got to the end and destroyed the heart. In a future video, we'll update all this so, it does a little bit more. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video and would like to see more, you know what to do. And if you would like to support this channel, watch these videos 2 weeks early, or just want to download the project files, you can do so through my Patreon linked below.